Let's talk about love. You know, our sermon series right now is about these big questions, but we could just pause on this one and do a whole sermon series on love. How to love annoying and difficult people. How to love your enemy. I was really tempted to follow one of those paths, but I'm not going to try to go there. I just wanted to zero in on these two halves of love that Jesus talks about, love of neighbor and love of God. And it's the perfect weekend to talk about love, Valentine's Day, our annual holiday for lovers, florists, and chocolatiers, commemorating a saint whose story nobody at all knows. But we needed to invent a patron saint to celebrate romantic love because there's very little of that at all in the Bible. When couples meet with me to prepare for a wedding, I always ask that one of the readings in the service comes from the Bible. And they're often disappointed at the list of possible scriptures that I give to them. Sometimes we'll say, aren't there any others that you can suggest that talk about how wonderful our love for each other is? They seem to think there's a special hoard of love scriptures that I'm holding back on them at. I have to say, no, that's about it. They can't believe that there are almost no Bible verses that celebrate romantic love. They want something along the lines of Elizabeth Barrett Browning or Khalil Gibran to be in the Bible. And so, like everybody else, they have to settle for 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient and kind. It's not boastful or arrogant or rude. And of course, those words weren't written for a wedding at all. St. Paul wrote them to an unruly congregation to help them learn how to get along with each other. Romantic love is such a powerful, irrational force in our lives that we can't imagine that it's not somehow divine. For many of us to fall in love, to find our soulmate, the one who has the keys that fit our locks, to live happily ever after with your heart's true love is the very most important thing in life, and we want our romantic love to never end. In the traditional marriage vows that I give to a couple, they promise to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until we are parted by death. I once had a couple that wanted to get rid of that last line, until we are parted by death. They couldn't stand it. They wanted to replace it with, for all eternity. Because they thought their married love was a many-splendored eternal thing that would go on forever. And so with our obsession with romantic love as the pinnacle of all love, it might come as a surprise to us when we hear Jesus saying that what matters most is love for God and love for our neighbor. He doesn't say a thing at all about romantic love, nor does he even make love for friends and family a priority, because that, of course, is the other sort of love that we immortalize and sentimentalize. It's no coincidence that Mother's Day, like Valentine's Day, is the other annual holiday for florists and chocolatiers. Only on that day, it's Mother that becomes the saint. But like Valentine's Day, Mother's Day is not a sacred day on our church calendar. Kierkegaard has been really helpful to me over the years in thinking about love. And he points out that in this command to love God and neighbor, Jesus has taken romantic love and the love for family and friends off of the throne that we've put them on. Doris Carlson is a dear, sweet woman. She'll be 90 years old next month. But my affectionate love for my mother is quite natural. I'm her son. And she's usually lovable most of the time. Joe Jaquay is a wonderful man whom I love dearly. And I don't need Jesus to tell me to love Joe. Not usually, anyway. To find the love of your life and to have family and friends that you love very much are wonderful things to be thankful for, and they're true gifts from God. But neither of those types of love is what matters most. Love your God and love your neighbor. Perhaps Jesus commands that because he knows that we don't need any help in desiring romantic love or in feeling affection for our family. Nobody needs to be commanded to fall in love or to hit it off with your best friend. Now, those are wonderful human loves that God has planted in us, and they're natural to nearly everyone, but they're not what matters most. Loving your neighbor, it should be said, is not the same as liking your neighbor. It's much easier to love the ones that we like, isn't it? But Jesus doesn't command us to have warm feelings. He commands us to love. You can't command a feeling. You can only command a behavior. And that's what Christian love is. C.S. Lewis, who's also been very helpful to me in thinking about love, said, "Don't waste your time bothering whether you love your neighbor. Act as if you did." Are you lonely? Your neighbor is right in front of you, waiting to be loved. Do you wish you had a little bit more romance in your life? You don't need to wish for a neighbor to love. There's always one around. At some point, my mother will die. At some point, Joe or I will go first. But your neighbor, you will never lose. Your neighbor is always right there, right in front of you. You will always have a neighbor to love. In the Gospel of Luke, we have another version of this same story where a man runs up to Jesus and says, "Jesus, what's the greatest commandment?" And Jesus says the same thing, love your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And then the man who wants to whittle it down to a list of people that he only likes being his neighbors asks Jesus, "Well, who is my neighbor?" And do you remember the story then that Jesus tells in response? The Good Samaritan. A man's walking down the road. He gets jumped by robbers and mugged and left lying in the ditch. And a Bible scholar comes walking along, but he keeps on walking even though he sees the man. And then a pastor comes walking along and keeps on walking down the road even though he sees the man because they're very busy. They have appointments to get to. Then a Samaritan, a heretical half-breed, comes along, and he sees this beat-up man lying in the ditch. And it says his heart is moved with compassion. And so he picks up that bloodied man, puts him on his horse, takes him to a hotel and checks him in for the night, cleans up his wounds, and gives him something to eat. And then Jesus says, who was the neighbor in this story? To love your neighbor is to be a neighbor. It's a choice. It's to respond in compassion simply because the person standing in front of you is another human being that's loved by God. It's marching for peace in the middle of winter because the youth in North Lawndale shouldn't be afraid to go outside at night. It's advocating for the little girl who goes to an underfunded public school because you believe that she should have just as good an education as the school that your kids go to. It means, as Martin Luther King pointed out to us, that all of our neighborhoods are interrelated, that we are tied together in a single garment, and whatever affects one directly affects everyone. Love your neighbor is the second half of love, and I haven't talked about the first half yet. Love your God. Well, what does that mean? Notice Jesus says, love your God. He doesn't say, love God, just like he doesn't say, love humanity in general. He doesn't say, love the supreme being or the creator of the universe or the divine life force that keeps everything going. He says, love your God. Your God. God is your God. Before you ever love God, God loves you. God knows you. God is on your side. God is your God. We enjoy being loved because we're clever, we're talented, we're attractive. We long to be adored for our innate abilities. And even as adults, we carry this little child around inside of us that says, look at me, look at me. But there's nothing intrinsically lovable about you that causes God to love you. Now, that's not to say there's nothing intrinsically lovable about you. It's just that God's love for you doesn't depend on you, on who you are, on what you do, any of that, because God is love. There is no more secure love that you will ever have than God's love for you. As a mother loves her tiny baby before her child is ever consciously aware of her, that's how God loves. As that father who rushes to embrace the prodigal son who returns as a disgraced failure, that's how God loves. I think that's why Jesus, more than any other name for God in the New Testament, calls God Father. It's a relationship for him. When Jesus lost his father Joseph probably at a young age, he just disappears from the story in the Bible. I wonder if it had been Mary that he had lost, if he would have called God Mother. When Jesus talks to God, and when he teaches us to talk to God, it's with a term of endearment, our Father. So that means That love for God is first of all not some disinterested admiration of a distant creator beyond our understanding. It's more like a little boy crying out, "I want my mommy." I remember when I was 5 years old, my family was living in Dallas, Texas, and I went downtown with my dad one day when he attended different business. And we came out of this office building, and the sidewalk was a mass of people. It was busy, and I looked up at the skyscrapers, and I was feeling a bit overwhelmed. And so I reached out and grabbed my father's hand. But then I heard this strange voice coming from my father's hand, and I looked up, and I realized I had grabbed the hand of a stranger. I was terrified, and I cried out. Fortunately, my dad was right behind me, and he said to me, "It's okay, Jeff. I'm right here." And I ran to him. I no longer need to hold my father's hand for security. And even if I wanted to, I couldn't. His hands are gone. But I still need to know that I'm not alone. And I will never outgrow the need to hear God saying, "It's okay. I'm right here." My love for God hasn't matured much beyond that place where love begins, with my arms outstretched and with needy prayers on my lips, like, help me, forgive me, be with me. My love for God hasn't matured much beyond that need for God, but I think that's okay, because God delights in being needed. God delights in having our trust. What matters most? Well, we get a lot of answers to that question in life, don't we? Having a good career, a good education, surely your health matters most. If you don't have that, you don't have anything. Or falling in love, having a wonderful family, a good home, pursuing your passions and your dreams. Jesus kind of clears all of that away and recenters and focuses our life on loving relationships. Love for God and love for neighbor. But the question is still left hanging there. It's left hanging there for all of us, because when I think about my own life and in my 50 years, what have I been centered on? What have I been focusing on? How have I spent my time and my energy and my money? The question is still hanging there in front of us. What matters most?